August 15th, 1945. Across Tokyo, radios crackled to life in homes that still had power. People stopped what they were doing. Some knelt. Others stood frozen in doorways or crowded around speakers in the street. The voice coming through was one most had never heard before. Thin, formal, speaking in a kind of Japanese so old-fashioned that many struggled to follow the words. It was the Emperor, and he was telling them they had lost. For the first time in its history, Japan had been defeated. Not just defeated, devastated. 2 atomic bombs. Firebombing campaigns that turned entire cities into ash, millions dead, an economy in ruins, and now American forces were coming. No one knew what would happen next. In Washington, the mood was different. There was relief, yes, the war was over, but there was also uncertainty. Japan wasn't just another enemy. It was an island nation that had launched a surprise attack, fought with terrifying discipline, and refused to surrender until the very end. Now the United States had to decide what to do with it. Some wanted punishment. Some wanted revenge. Others saw an opportunity. By late August, American ships began arriving in Tokyo Bay. Thousands of troops poured onto Japanese soil. They came prepared for resistance, maybe even sabotage. But what they found was silence. Streets were empty. Buildings stood hollow. People watched from windows but didn't move. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japanese officials signed the surrender documents. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the center of it all. Tall and composed, his voice steady as he spoke about peace and rebuilding. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like someone who had a plan. And he did. MacArthur had been named Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. That meant he was now, in effect, the ruler of Japan. Not officially, not by title, but in practice, yes. He had more authority over the country than anyone else, including the emperor. It was an impossible job. Japan was broken. Its cities were rubble. Its military was dismantled. Its people were hungry, exhausted, and humiliated. The country had no government that could function, no economy that could recover on its own, and no trust from the rest of the world. But MacArthur didn't see a defeated enemy. He saw a blank slate. Within weeks, American forces set up headquarters in Tokyo. They began distributing food. They started rebuilding roads and power lines. They opened schools. And then, quietly, they began reshaping the entire structure of Japanese society. The plan wasn't just occupation, it was transformation. In Washington, officials watched closely. Some were skeptical, others were hopeful. But everyone understood one thing. Japan couldn't be left to rot. It sat too close to the Soviet Union, too close to China, too close to Korea. If Japan fell into chaos, or worse, into communist hands, the entire Pacific would be at risk. So, the United States made a choice. Not out of kindness, not out of guilt, but out of strategy. They would rebuild Japan. And in doing so, they would turn an enemy into an ally. But first, they had to do something no occupying force had ever really done before. They had to make the Japanese people believe it was possible. MacArthur moved into the Dai-ichi Life Insurance building in central Tokyo. It was one of the few structures still standing. From his office on the 6th floor, he could see the ruins spreading out in every direction. Entire neighborhoods reduced to foundations and twisted metal. Smoke still rose from some areas weeks after the surrender. He didn't waste time. One of his first orders was unexpected. He told his staff that the emperor would not be arrested. He would not be tried as a war criminal. He would not be removed. This shocked people on both sides. In America, many wanted Hirohito held accountable. In Japan, people feared he would be executed. But MacArthur understood something that others didn't. The emperor was the one thing holding Japanese society together. Remove him, and the country might collapse entirely. Keep him, and you had a symbol that could help guide the transformation. But there was a condition. The emperor would have to renounce his divinity. On January 1st, 1946, Emperor Hirohito did exactly that. In a radio address, he declared that he was not a god. He was a human being. It was a quiet moment, but it changed everything. For centuries, the emperor had been seen as divine, untouchable, the living embodiment of Japan itself. Now, He was just a man. And if the emperor could change, so could Japan. MacArthur pushed further. He ordered the creation of a new constitution. Not a revision of the old one, a completely new document. And it would be written fast. A team of American lawyers and Japanese officials worked around the clock. They drafted it in a matter of days. The new constitution did something radical. It gave women the right to vote. It guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. It broke up the old aristocratic system, and most importantly, it included Article 9. Article 9 stated that Japan would renounce war forever. It would not maintain a military for offensive purposes. It would not threaten other nations. It would become, by law, a peaceful country. Some in Japan resisted. Some in America thought it went too far, but MacArthur pushed it through. The Constitution was adopted in 1947. At the same time, the occupation forces began breaking up the zaibatsu, the massive, family-owned conglomerates that had controlled Japan's economy and funded its war machine. Companies like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo were split apart. Their leaders were removed. The goal was to decentralize power and create a more democratic economy. Land reform followed. Before the war, a small number of landlords owned most of the farmland. Peasants worked it but owned nothing. Now, the occupation government forced landlords to sell. Millions of farmers became landowners for the first time.
It was one of the largest redistributions of wealth in history, and it happened quietly, without revolution. Food was still scarce, rations were tight, people stood in long lines for rice and vegetables, but slowly, things started to move. Factories that had built weapons began making radios and bicycles. Schools reopened. Trains started running again. And then, in 1948, everything changed. Across the Sea of Japan, in China, the communist forces led by Mao Zedong were winning. The nationalists, backed by the United States, were losing ground fast. By 1949, Mao would control the entire country. And just north of Japan, in Korea, tensions were rising between Soviet-backed forces in the north and American-backed forces in the south. Suddenly, Japan wasn't just a defeated enemy that needed rebuilding, it was a frontline state in a new kind of war. The Cold War had arrived in Asia, and almost overnight, American priorities shifted. The focus was no longer on punishing Japan or even just reforming it. The focus was on making Japan strong enough to stand as a barrier against communism. Washington sent more aid, more advisors, more money. The occupation, which had started as a mission to demilitarize and democratize, was now becoming something else. It was becoming a partnership. But not everyone in Japan was ready for that, and not everyone in America trusted it. On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and pushed into South Korea. Within days, they had taken Seoul. The South Korean army was collapsing. The United Nations called for intervention. President Truman ordered American forces into the fight, and just like that, Japan became the most important piece of land in the Pacific. American troops stationed in Japan were rushed to Korea. Supply lines ran through Japanese ports. Wounded soldiers were flown to hospitals in Tokyo and Osaka. Factories that had been making radios and bicycles were now making trucks, uniforms, and equipment for the war effort. Japan, barely 5 years removed from its own defeat, was now the supply hub for an American war. The transformation was sudden and massive. Orders poured in. Japanese companies that had been struggling to survive were now working day and night to meet demand. Steel production jumped. Shipyards roared back to life. Textile mills ran around the clock. Money started flowing into the economy at a rate no one had expected. It was called the Korean War boom. For the first time since the war ended, Japan had purpose again. Not as a conqueror, not as an empire, but as a producer, a builder, a partner. MacArthur, who had been running the occupation with near absolute authority, was now also commanding the war in Korea. He spent less time in Tokyo and more time focused on the battlefield. The occupation government continued its work, but the urgency had shifted. Reform was still happening, but survival was more important. And survival meant Japan needed to be stable, functional, and aligned with the West. In 1951, the United States decided it was time to end the occupation. Not because the job was finished, but because the situation had changed. Japan couldn't remain under foreign control forever. It needed sovereignty. But it also needed protection. In September 1951, representatives from Japan and 48 other nations gathered in San Francisco to sign a peace treaty. It was called the Treaty of San Francisco, and it officially ended the state of war between Japan and the Allied powers. But there was a second document signed the same day, one that didn't get as much attention but mattered just as much: the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. It was short, just 5 articles, but it did something critical. It allowed the United States to keep military bases in Japan, and it committed the U.S. to defending Japan if it was ever attacked. Japan would not rebuild its own military. It didn't need to. America would protect it. In exchange, Japan would host American troops, provide land for bases, and support U.S. operations in Asia. It wasn't an alliance between equals, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. On April 25, 1952, the treaty took effect. The occupation officially ended. Japan was a sovereign nation again. MacArthur had already been relieved of his command a year earlier after clashing with Truman over strategy in Korea. He left Japan in April 1951, and thousands of Japanese citizens lined the streets to see him off. Some waved, some cried. He had been a ruler, yes, but to many, he had also been a protector. Now Japan was on its own. Sort of. American bases remained. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops stayed stationed across the country. Okinawa, which had seen some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, remained under full American control. It wouldn't be returned to Japan for another 2 decades. But Japan had its government back. It had its economy growing. And it had something it hadn't had in years: hope. By the mid-1950s, Japanese factories were producing cars, cameras, electronics, and machinery. Exports were rising. The standard of living was improving. Children who had grown up during the war were now teenagers attending rebuilt schools, looking toward a future that didn't involve bombs or hunger. But beneath the surface, tensions remained. Some Japanese resented the American bases. Protests broke out in cities where U.S. soldiers were stationed. There were incidents, crimes, resentment. The wounds of war hadn't fully healed, and the presence of foreign troops was a constant reminder of defeat. Still, the partnership held, because both sides needed it. Japan needed security and access to markets. America needed a stable democratic ally in a region that was turning increasingly hostile. China was now communist. North Korea was armed and aggressive. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence, and across Southeast Asia, revolutionary movements were gaining ground. Japan wasn't just useful, it was essential. And slowly, quietly, the relationship began to shift. Japan was no longer just the defeated enemy being managed.
It was becoming a partner, a friend, and eventually one of America's closest allies. But that transformation didn't happen because of speeches or treaties alone. It happened because of choices made in moments of crisis, and because 2 nations that had once tried to destroy each other decided that survival mattered more than revenge. By 1955, Japan's economy was growing faster than almost anyone had predicted. Factories that had been bombed flat a decade earlier were now running 3 shifts. Tokyo, which had been a landscape of ash and rubble, was filling with new buildings, new roads, new life. But the growth wasn't random. It was directed. The Japanese government, now led by conservative politicians who had survived the war and the occupation, made a decision. Japan would focus on exports. It would build products the world wanted and sell them cheaper and better than anyone else. Steel, ships, electronics, cars. The government worked closely with private companies, offering loans, protection, and guidance. It wasn't socialism. It wasn't pure capitalism either. It was something in between, and it worked. American aid helped. Billions of dollars had flowed into Japan during the occupation and the years after. Some of it went to rebuilding infrastructure, some went to stabilizing the currency, some went directly into industries that the U.S. wanted to see succeed. Because a strong Japan meant a strong Pacific. And a strong Pacific meant the Soviets and the Chinese couldn't expand unchecked. But the aid alone didn't create the miracle. The Japanese people did. Workers put in long hours for low wages. Families saved instead of spent. Companies reinvested profits into research and development instead of paying dividends. There was a sense of collective mission. The country had been destroyed. Now it would be rebuilt. not by occupation forces, not by foreign charity, but by the Japanese themselves. By 1960, Japan's economy had returned to pre-war levels. By 1965, it had surpassed them. Sony was making transistor radios that sold around the world. Toyota and Nissan were exporting cars to America. Panasonic was producing televisions that were cheaper and more reliable than their American competitors. The phrase "made in Japan," which had once meant cheap and low quality, was starting to mean something different. It meant innovative, efficient, dependable. And the relationship with the United States was deepening. In 1960, the two countries signed a revised security treaty. This one was different. It wasn't just about American protection, it was mutual. If Japan were attacked, the U.S. would defend it, and Japan would support U.S. operations in the region. But the new treaty sparked massive protests in Tokyo. Thousands of students, workers, and activists flooded the streets. They surrounded the National Diet Building. They clashed with police. Some saw the treaty as a betrayal of Article 9, the constitutional promise that Japan would never go to war again. Others feared it would drag Japan into conflicts it wanted no part of. The protests were intense, but they didn't stop the treaty. It passed, and the alliance held. Because for all the anger, for all the fear, most Japanese understood the reality. The world was dangerous. China had nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had a massive military. North Korea was hostile. And across Asia, instability was the norm, not the exception. Japan's economic miracle had been built on a foundation of security. And that security came from the alliance. So the bases stayed, the treaty remained, and the partnership, strained at times, continued. By the 1970s, Japan and the United States weren't just allies, they were deeply interconnected, economically, militarily, culturally. Japanese tourists visited America. American movies played in Tokyo theaters. Trade flowed in both directions. And while tensions flared from time to time, the relationship had become something neither side could afford to lose. Two nations that had fought one of the most brutal wars in history had become partners. Not because they forgot the past, but because they chose a different future. But the future couldn't erase what had happened. In the 1970s and 80s, as Japan rose and prospered, old wounds began to surface. Not just in Japan, but across Asia. South Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, countries that had suffered under Japanese occupation during the war, watched Japan's economic success with mixed feelings. Some admired it, others resented it, and many wanted something Japan was reluctant to give: an apology. For decades, Japanese leaders had offered statements of regret. They acknowledged suffering, they expressed remorse, but the language was often vague, carefully worded, and left room for interpretation. Some politicians downplayed Japan's wartime actions. Others visited Yasukuni Shrine, a site that honored Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals. Each visit sparked outrage in China and Korea. Each statement that fell short of a full apology reopened old wounds. The United States found itself in an uncomfortable position. It needed Japan as an ally, but it also had relationships with South Korea, the Philippines, and other nations that had been victims of Japanese aggression. Balancing those relationships wasn't easy. And within Japan, the question of the past divided people. Some believed the country had done enough. The war was over, Japan had been punished. It had rebuilt itself into a peaceful democratic nation. Why keep apologizing for something that happened decades ago? Others believed Japan hadn't fully reckoned with what it had done. That textbooks glossed over atrocities, that the government minimized suffering, that without a true acknowledgement, the healing couldn't be complete. It was a debate that never really ended, but through it all, the alliance with the United States stayed strong, because the reasons for it were still real. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union began to collapse. The Cold War, which had shaped the world for more than 40 years, was ending. Some thought the U.S.-Japan alliance might weaken, that without the Soviet threat, there was less reason to maintain such a close partnership. But the opposite happened. New challenges emerged. China, no longer isolated, was opening up economically and growing fast. North Korea was developing nuclear weapons. Regional tensions were rising, not falling. Japan and the United States realized they still needed each other, maybe even more than before.
In the 1990s, the alliance was redefined again. Japan began taking on more responsibility. It contributed billions of dollars to the Gulf War. It sent self-defense forces on humanitarian missions. It participated in peacekeeping operations. These were small steps, but they mattered. Japan was still bound by Article 9. It still couldn't have a full military, but it was finding ways to support international security without crossing the line into warfare. And the United States supported that evolution, because a Japan that could share the burden was better than one that only depended on protection. By the 2000s, the relationship looked different than it had in 1952. Japan was no longer a junior partner. It was a major economic power, a technological leader, and a key player in global affairs. American companies worked with Japanese firms. Students studied in each other's countries. Cultural exchange was constant. Sushi restaurants opened in American suburbs. Baseball became huge in Japan. The two nations had become intertwined in ways that went far beyond treaties and bases. But the bases were still there, and so were the tensions that came with them. In Okinawa, where the largest concentration of U.S. forces remained, protests continued. Crimes committed by American service members sparked anger. Accidents involving military aircraft raised fears. The people of Okinawa had never asked to host tens of thousands of foreign troops, and many wanted them gone. But the Japanese government and the American government kept the arrangement in place, because strategically, Okinawa mattered. It was close to Taiwan, close to China, close to the shipping lanes that carried much of the world's trade. The alliance wasn't perfect, it wasn't always comfortable, but it endured. In 2011, a massive earthquake struck off the coast of Japan. A tsunami followed, killing nearly 20,000 people. The Fukushima nuclear plant melted down. It was one of the worst disasters in Japan's modern history, and the United States responded immediately. Thousands of American troops joined the relief effort. They cleared roads, delivered supplies, searched for survivors. Aircraft carriers provided power to affected areas. The operation was called Operation Tomodachi, Tomodachi meaning friend. It was a reminder that the alliance wasn't just about strategy or economics. It was built on decades of shared experience. And in moments of crisis, that mattered. By the 2020s, Japan and the United States were facing a new set of challenges. China's military was expanding. North Korea had nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Cybersecurity threats were growing. The balance of power in Asia was shifting. And once again, the alliance was adapting. Japan began increasing its defense budget. It reinterpreted Article 9 to allow for collective self-defense, meaning it could assist allies under attack. It strengthened ties with other democracies in the region: Australia, India, South Korea. The country that had renounced war in 1947 was now preparing to defend itself and its partners. Not because it wanted conflict, but because the world remained dangerous. And through it all, the bond with the United States held. The transformation of Japan and the United States from enemies to allies wasn't a miracle. It wasn't inevitable, and it wasn't simple. It was a choice made over and over again by leaders and citizens across decades, in moments of crisis and in moments of calm. It began with defeat and occupation, with a country in ruins and a victor willing to rebuild instead of destroy, with MacArthur's decision to keep the emperor, with a constitution that rejected war, with land reform and economic aid, and a bet that democracy could take root in a place where it had never existed before. But the real turning point came in 1950 when war broke out in Korea and Japan suddenly became essential, not as a defeated enemy to be controlled, but as a partner to be supported. The factories that had built weapons for the Imperial Army now built supplies for American troops. The ports that had launched invasions now resupplied a defensive war. And in that shift, Japan found its footing again, not as a military power, but as an economic one. The United States made that possible, with protection, with aid, with access to markets. But Japan did the work. Its people rebuilt the cities.
Its companies innovated and competed. Its government managed growth with discipline and focus. By the 1970s, the relationship had flipped. Japan was no longer dependent. It was powerful, and the United States had to adjust to that. There were trade disputes, there were cultural misunderstandings, there were moments when the partnership felt strained. But it never broke, because both sides understood something important. The world didn't stop being dangerous just because Japan became prosperous. China was rising, the Soviet Union and later Russia remained a threat. North Korea was unpredictable. And the region, which held some of the world's most important trade routes and largest populations, couldn't afford instability. Japan needed security. The United States needed a stable, democratic ally in Asia. And so they stayed together. The alliance wasn't built on trust alone. It was built on interest, on strategy, on the cold calculation that cooperation served both nations better than anything else. But over time, something else grew. Respect, familiarity, shared experience. Generations of Americans grew up eating Japanese food, watching Japanese shows, driving Japanese cars. Generations of Japanese grew up listening to American music, watching American movies, studying in American universities. The two countries became connected in ways that went beyond governments or militaries. They became part of each other's lives. And when disasters struck, earthquakes, tsunamis, economic crises, they helped each other. Not because treaties required it, but because the relationship had become real. That didn't erase the past. The war still happened, the bombs still fell, the suffering was real, and it didn't disappear just because decades passed. But the past didn't have to define the future. Japan and the United States proved that enemies could become allies, that nations which had fought with everything they had could choose a different path, that rebuilding was possible, that change was possible. It didn't happen quickly, it didn't happen easily, and it didn't happen without cost. But it happened. And in a world that often felt stuck in cycles of conflict and revenge, that mattered. The US-Japan alliance became one of the most important partnerships of the modern era. It shaped the Pacific. It helped stabilize Asia. It contributed to decades of relative peace in a region that had known war and chaos for so long. And it showed that even after the worst kind of conflict, there was a way forward. Not by forgetting, not by pretending the past didn't happen, but by choosing, again and again, to build something better. Today, American and Japanese forces train together. Their economies are deeply connected. Their citizens travel freely between the two countries. The bases are still there. The treaty is still in place. And the challenges are still real. China's power continues to grow. North Korea remains a threat. Regional tensions flare and fade and flare again. But the alliance endures. Because 75 years ago, in the ruins of Tokyo, in the shadow of defeat, two nations made a choice. They chose partnership over punishment. They chose rebuilding over revenge. They believed that the future didn't have to look like the past. And that choice changed everything.